Welcome to Crime Scenes and Cultures, where we seek to demystify the mysterious for public safety agencies and forensic professionals. Joined today, as always, is my award-winning forensic archaeologist friend and co-host, Stephen Katz. Stephen, how are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing fine, Tony. How about you?
Doing well. You know, in today's episode, we're going to digress slightly from our typical format to discuss how circumstances and events surrounding certain crime scenes can lead to public misunderstandings and even prejudice.
The case we'll be discussing took place in a rented upstairs apartment on the 800 block at North Rampart Street, New Orleans, in October of 2006, and was the scene of a homicide and a criminal dismemberment. In my 2021 dissertation with the University of Verona titled Forensic and Medical Legal Aspects of Necrophilia, I briefly discussed the case. Since then, I visited the site 2 or 3 times and even joined a ghost tour with paranormal and equipment and a tarot card reading with my sons before the COVID lockdown. Background-wise, the apartment is a circa 1829 Creole cottage that is sometimes referred to as a Rampart murder house by locals and tour guides. It once housed Princess Miriam Mani's Vodou Spiritual Temple and Cultural Center. The temple itself was destroyed by an electrical fire in February of 2016, and it's since relocated to 1428 North Rampart Street. Presently, it is located by Bloody Mary's Haunted Museum and Voodoo Pharmacy Spirit Shop. The owner of the museum is Mary Bellon, who goes by the moniker Bloody Mary. Bloody Mary is an 11th generation Creole whose family came to New Orleans in 1718. Her website states that she is a voodoo queen in New Orleans voodoo tradition. Tony, can you actually explain what New Orleans voodoo is and how it differs from other regional forms of voodoo?
With New Orleans voodoo, we see some different aspects. Of course, when we use the word voodoo, we have to understand that there are several different traditions of voodoo. We have West African voodoo, we have Haitian voodoo, Dominican voodoo, we have New Orleans voodoo, and the New Orleans voodoo has some very distinct spiritual personalities in the pantheon of spirits that are honored and respected in this tradition. You will have personalities such as Marie Laveau or Annie Christmas or Dr. John. And in most of these cases, these are regional personalities. And so you won't necessarily see Marie Laveau being invoked in a Haitian voodoo ceremony or a Dominican voodoo ceremony. So we do see some distinction there. There's also recognition of specific social statuses, such as being a queen as opposed to a mambo, or a particular style of ceremony or specific artifacts may differ there in New Orleans voodoo.
Well, I had the opportunity to speak with Bloody Mary a few times at her museum and at a convention in New Orleans, which is, my mom would say, good people and very knowledgeable and respectful. Tony, from past conversations with you, I remember you saying that you know Priestess Miriam.
Yes, Priestess Miriam has been an excellent ambassador for education and a proponent for education locally and actually around the world, trying to communicate the actual traditions of voodoo in New Orleans. And she is a very respected elder in the work. And my few interactions I've had with her have been very, very positive. So she's a very good representative that people could actually turn to if they wanted more understanding on New Orleans voodoo.
Okay, thank you, Tony.
Steve, you mentioned this case that took place. Can you expand on who was directly involved in this aforementioned case and maybe even some of the specifics of this case?
Sure. The murder victim was Adriane Addie Hall, and the person who later confessed to her killing was her live-in boyfriend, Zach Bowen. Addie and Zach both are 28 years old and live somewhat of a bohemian lifestyle and worked as bartenders in French Quarter. They gained a little bit of celebrity attention or notoriety because their decision not to evacuate the city during Hurricane Katrina. Zach committed suicide by jumping off at the roof at the Omni Royal Hotel New Orleans, which is give or take a 15-minute walk from the crime scene. On his person, they found a detailed letter of confession on his corpse, and it said, "This is not accidental. I had to take my own life to pay for the one I took. If you send a patrol car to 826 North Rampart, you will find a dismembered corpse of my girlfriend Addie in the oven, on the stove, and in the fridge, and a full signed confession from myself." The murder itself made headlines, and it inspired a novel by Ethan Brown and mine called Shake the Devil Off, and subsequently a 2014 documentary called Zach and Addie. Both offer detailed insights into the events leading up to and following the homicide. My interest was sparked by rumors of cannibalism and necrophilia, which was what I was researching at the time. And all that stuff's been since debunked as just urban legends.
That is a difficult region to sometimes sort between urban legends and actual truth. Because there is such a presence of different magical traditions, various forms of spiritualism within the region, combined with the influence of tourism. And so you find sort of a two ends of the spectrum where you have actual practices, and then you have the tourism industry that sort of, in many cases, will build upon the presence of magical traditions, and whether it be from ghost tours or selling little voodoo dolls in shops and things like that. So I can see how those two elements might conflict there. So are there any specific theories or hypotheses in regarding the motive behind Zach's murder of Addie?
Well, in thinking about it, there's been three solid theories proposed. There are suggestions that external factors associated with the voodoo spiritual temple may have affected the couple, particularly Zach, and influenced his overall mental health. Alcohol and drug abuse, coupled with domestic conflicts, which they made the news on that several times. And the final one was post-traumatic stress disorder and depression. Zach was a decorated military veteran who served in Iraq and was known to have PTSD.
So, of these theories, which of them do you feel is probably the most plausible?
Well, taking everything into consideration based on all the factors, I believe that the PTSD and substance abuse were the causative factors. The notion that the negative force or influence associated with living in a temple, or living above the temple, could have led someone to commit such an atrocious act is, unfounded. And the temple itself is regarded as a place of positivity and healing. Several reality TV shows have filmed episodes in the former temple and cited that it could have been the stone tape theory regarding the building itself. Well, the stone tape theory is kind of a little bit of pseudoscience, but what it goes as is it was introduced in the 17th or 19th century, by Charles Babbage. And he states that emotions, memories, and trauma are collected and stored in the materials such as buildings and rocks, like a cassette tape. The theory itself is based, again, on the paranormal and is considered to be pseudoscience.
Interesting theory. We know that there are specific geographic places that we go to that carry a certain feeling to being in these environments. If you were to go to Gettysburg, or if you were to go to a plantation where there was, human beings forced into slavery or victims of violence or abuse, we sometimes we kind of get the feels in these environments. And, is that, hypothetically speaking, is that psychological? Is that spiritual? I don't know. But I get what you're saying about that stone tape theory being unfounded as far as being a sound theory in regards to this.
Okay. Well, with that being said, Tony, I have a few questions for you. The first one, when looking at past events and police reports about hoodoo and voodoo, do you need to consider that law enforcement officials are likely to exhibit a certain level of personal bias and overlook potential key evidence? And the second one is, I would still like to know how practitioners can help preserve their practices and what their options are on Spirituality today and the importance of diversity in spirituality.
Well, your first question regarding potential bias in looking at evidence at scenes. We as human beings all have a specific amount of bias, and that bias is typically something that is stored in us as a child. We may be taught at a young age that a specific practice is or a specific culture is anti-traditional. And so therefore you must look at it through a lens that automatically views it as deviant or potentially malevolent. I think that one of the things that occurs in many cases is when we have lack of education, when we have lack of training, where public safety officials are not able to see some of the examples of whether it be sacred spaces or ceremonies or artifacts, when they're not able to see that in a controlled environment and they encounter it in the field, they may have culture shock. And, I can't tell you the number of cases where I've had officers tell me, I walked in this room and I saw these candles and these bones and all this stuff, and I backed out. I was saying, no, I'm not messing with that. Or you have cases where perhaps a level of bias would lead us to be tempted to not take something serious or to look at things as simply mundane. We know that in many magical traditions that there are specific tools that are used that look like just mundane materials, whether it be a rock or a branch from a tree, or whether it be, a bowl of water. And if we're not looking at it in a cultural context, then it may just appear to be a rock, a tree branch, a bowl of water to drink. And so I think education and training is definitely what is needed to deal with those potential incidents of bias. In regards to how practitioners can preserve their practices and what their opinions are on spirituality today, I can tell you some of the different cultural consultants that I speak with on a regular basis in 2025 sometimes struggle with the notion of internet traditions. And, you take someone who has grown up in a religion, or you take someone who has been through several years of initiation and experience in a particular religious tradition, and all of a sudden they're faced with a 19-year-old that has gotten on the internet and learned about that, a specific tradition, and now they claim to be this high priest or high priestess, and they claim to have all this knowledge where elders in the tradition, have served years in these traditions. So there's sometimes that particular conflict. I think one of the great things that any culture can do is to offer education to those outside of their community. I think that helps build bridges of understanding. And in some cases, it can eradicate or at least lessen bias when you have encounters with these different cultural traditions.
Thank you, Tony. Those are really great explanations, and it answered the questions amazingly.
Now, you spoke about the museum there. What are some of your observations from the museum?
Well, I didn't know what to expect, to be honest with you. But when I went into the museum, it felt, I guess, akin to like embarking on a certain attraction at Disney. But however, it did feel there was a certain sense of comfort and welcomeness. And one of the first observations I noticed was build your own voodoo doll station, which of course I used. There were animal bones everywhere and lots of voodoo symbolism, candles, books, and the infamous spirit boards and all kinds of marketing about the paranormal.
Well, now, in those, you mentioned animal bones. Why do you think they would be at the museum and even for sale in the gift shop?
Well, from what I understand and, prior research, the reading of bones is a form of divination that uses the animal bones in conjunction with other items such as shells, beads, and the like, and gleans divine information. Each individual bone has a meaning associated with it, and it's derived from the animal from which it was obtained from. An example, the most thing that I saw that was there that I had to kind of giggled, my immaturity shown again, was there was a baculum there. And my son asked, what was a baculum? I gave him the scientist thing, and I said, a baculum is a penis bone. That one is a penis bone of a raccoon. He goes, well, Dad, what does that mean? Is it just whatever? And I said, well, it serves a dual purpose. It's associated with sexuality and hoodoo, And the raccoon, vacuum itself, is sometimes worn as an amulet to symbolize luck or love.
Absolutely. Here in the South, in the African American hoodoo tradition, there is a historical lineage of using that baculum, or as it's colloquially known as the kundong. And this particular material you may see placed in a bag similar to like a mojo bag. You may see it worn on a particular string around the neck or just carried by individuals. So it does have that historical lineage here in the South as well. Of everything you encountered at the museum, what would you say was probably the most remarkable?
Well, to this day, everything there, I still remember it plain as anything. But the most striking aspect of my museum visit was the variety of scents. It was like, sometimes it was somewhat overwhelming. And then I particularly found something that I love now, Florida water. And my research for this episode revealed that Florida water was introduced to the American market in 1808 in New York City by perfumer Robert Murray, and it's basically an American variant of traditional European cologne. Like most European colognes, it has a high alcohol content and features a citrus forward fragrance. And it highlights a sweet orange and, got it, I sound like I'm on a cooking show, but subtle undertones of clove and cinnamon. The name Florida water refers to the mythical fountain of youth, which is peculiarly located somewhere in Florida, and the floral nature of the scent. Tony, I didn't go into a whole lot of detail, but what are some of the uses of Florida water?
It's interesting. Florida water and a number of different colognes and perfumes are used in spiritual traditions around the world. You'll see, for example, with Florida water at a particular ceremony, it may be used for cleansing. For example, one particular ceremony that documented involving a Lukumi or Santeria community involved the calling of ancestors at the beginning of a ceremony. And there were a couple of substances that were used to cleanse the participants in this ceremony. One of them being powdered eggshell or cascarilla, and the other being Florida water. And Florida water has this component to it that is it's almost a cleansing energy that some practitioners have communicated to me. I had one particular case several years ago that was out of New York, and there was an individual who was practicing an Afro-Caribbean religious tradition, and they had actually gotten a lot of Florida water on them during this ceremony. And the Florida water has a pretty high alcohol content. And so when this individual came into contact with the flame from some candles, they actually caught themselves on fire. And so, there are some aspects there to be aware of as far as working scenes and things like that. Florida water is, used to be sold in spiritual supply stores only. Now you can find it at your local grocers. You can find it at dollar stores. And it's a very, very prolific substance. And, you'll find there are other colognes and perfumes, which would be, a great topic we talk about in a future episode. But there are other ones that are frequently used. Siete Machos. There's a tobacco water. There is Hoyt's cologne. A lot of these different liquid substances are used in various practices, and you'll find them in some cases sitting on altars or being used in cleansing rituals, being used in offerings to specific deities. And so there's a number of different uses of not only Florida water, but also a number of liquid substances that are used not only to affect the physical, because, the scent of some of this sort of places you in a mental space, and in many cases kind of is relaxing or invigorating. And then also they're recognized for potential spiritual elements that may be resonant in the liquids themselves.
As always, thank you. That was a great explanation. I got a lot out of it.
So in looking at cases like this, it's interesting that you pointed out, one of the initial theories had to do with the proximity of the voodoo temple to the crime scene. I think that is an example of how, in many cases, we immediately associate something that may be misunderstood or something that may be unfamiliar to us. We immediately associate it with something negative, contrasting that. Practitioners of these traditions and people who have been raised in these traditions and have lived their whole life practicing these traditions are typically seeking peace. They're seeking healing. Hollywood would have us believe that to practice voodoo, you are cannibalizing or sticking pins in dolls to hurt people, that you just bent on destruction, when nothing could be further from the truth. These traditions, particularly voodoo, focus on healing, focus on a respect for nature and the environment, and focus on a desire to connect with a specific creator or deity. And so I think Hollywood, as we've talked in many of our shows, Hollywood has done a great disservice to many of these traditions. And I think as a result of that, it affects how we view these specific cultures like voodoo.
Yeah, exactly.
So as we wrap things up today, let's sort of recap, that we had this horrible, horrible homicide that occurred, and whatever elements motivated this act of violence most likely had nothing to do with this particular situation. This horrible act of violence could have took place over a church, a synagogue, a mosque, in any sacred space for a particular religious tradition. And it just happened to take place where there was a sacred space for voodoo at one time. Stephen, as always, I've enjoyed talking with you, and we're going to look ahead this year to some future shows and look forward to sharing with you a little bit about demystifying the mysterious. You have been listening to Crime Scenes and Cultures with my guest host, Stephen Katz. We bid you a good day.
Good day.